Disabled by legislation. Now, we want to understand what that is, to be disabled by legislation, because we're talking about the Mental Health Act of Victoria here, and also the other mental health acts in Australia that should be made null and void laws because they involve acts of slavery and acts of torture. If someone said you were disabled, how would you argue that you're not disabled, and how might that someone that told you that was who you were, that you were disabled, how would that someone counter that with you are disabled because I said you were? Understanding this, you're understanding where a person is taken in by a psychiatrist by force and given a situation like that where they cannot get out of it. And this is what this legislation that disables people, the Mental Health Act of Victoria, does. There's a eugenics idea that of those people, and to take up anything that divides people is divisive into a not you, but those, and not you, but those that don't have what you do. So it's just dividing people. A government legislature that disables people from voting by calling a person disabled and shutting them down and shutting them up because the person was called disabled is an exploitation racket. And if that is currently happening and continues to happen in Australia, and it were to be called a civil war, would it also be considered that these spaces that psychiatrists do drag people off to, and people should not say if it were happening, because it is happening, this legislation drags off a quarter of the population. So that needs to be understood. And if it were to be considered a civil war in Australia at the moment, these places would be considered concentration camps. Given Daniel Andrews has used the term army of doctors and nurses, people are assuming that the Premier of Victoria is planning a fully fledged white coat totalitarian state with far worse encroachments and on more and more human rights, giving medicos excessive and unprecedented limits to disable the people of Victoria, as well as their industries and businesses. A government that disables industries and businesses on purpose and forces the community to adopt a medico uniform in the form of a breathing containment mask is imposing a false construct of medico device upon cultural integrity of Australians and their understanding of this part of the earth. The disabling of people's ability to communicate and breathe fresh air by mandating that people wear a breathing containment mask has the effect of equality before the law, in that the government blanket disabling of ability to communicate and breathe fresh air is imposed upon the whole population. Compare this to the Mental Health Act of Victoria, which makes for huge inequalities before the law and disabling of quarter of the population in horrifically cruel, violent ways that go far beyond discomfort of muffling of communication. And the isolation under forced psychiatry, far more extreme deprivation, prolonged, isolating, indefinite, until the person complies with the other violations. And that's what's been happening. That's been the reality that's been on the increase since Federation. That said, there should not be any forced medical orders. None at all, of any kind in a democracy. People should have the right to refuse those leech men and leech women, as they were long ago called, and their cohort or medicos that encroach on civil rights and scam the population in horrifically cruel ways while getting handouts from the government. Astronomical wages during a time when people's businesses and livelihoods are being shut down. Impairment accounts for a number of things when psychiatrists are adding up the funds they're likely to receive if they call someone impaired after violating the person with forced neurotoxins and other diabolical procedures. Compulsory mental health needs to be recognised as slavery and torture offence. I'll say that again. Compulsory mental health needs to be recognised as a slavery and torture offence that the PSY have committed, which should not be allowed to continue to be legislated. So we need this Mental Health Act of Victoria to be removed. Not just repealed and replaced, not reinvented, removed. And the issue of legal rights being denied should never be misconstrued into an issue of charity or funds, when what is being denied is freedom from slavery and torture. The government has obligations to not forcibly torture and enslave people. When police protect people enslaved and tortured by the psychiatrists, it should be about the police arresting the psychiatrists and prosecuting the psychiatrists for slavery and torture offences. Stopping corruption of existing human rights instruments and enabling reporting mechanisms for intrusive activity of a covert nature, as well as those intrusions that are obviously due to the perpetrating psychiatrist documenting details of their enslaving and torturing of people. And there's plenty of documentation there, and you've got the witness impact statements that are backed up by many witnesses. We're looking at 4 million plus people who have the ability to give these witness impact statements and should be given that same equality before the law in the courts and not denigrated in the courts due to that label that psychiatrists have given them. That should not be counting against a person, most especially because the psychiatrists are perpetrators of vile, cruel acts. Forced psychiatry has been compared to a medico intentionally and forcibly breaking a person's arms, legs, skull in order to disable the person, and then saying, there, now you know why you need welfare. Welfare isn't about anything other than those who want to exploit people in Australia. That's why it is at the moment. If Australia were to remove welfare, that wouldn't be a bad thing at this point, when welfare has become too disgusting and it's exploiting of people under the guise of welfare. And that's when it has to go. Eugenicists have been pushing the welfare state since Federation, and it's too violent to reform, bludgeoning people it claims to assist. Instead, people should receive reparations from the psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and their mental health coterie who have damaged their lives and livelihoods. The eugenics concepts that have made corruption grow really ugly should not be allowed to carry on, particularly in the legislature. There needs to be a strong movement away from eugenics-based corruption in the medical industry and government exploitation of that corruption for their own corrupt means. A human rights instrument is not a medical instrument, not a welfare instrument either. Human rights is about stopping acts of crime upon people, most especially when those crimes are disguised in government legislation as medical interventions or policing. The horrible idea of dividing people and subjecting them to feeding taps for having a digit missing is someone's way of saying what next for the eugenicists and their puddle of what for humanity. Why is it so important that everyone have the same digits? People, medicos are greedy for more and more people, live and dead for experiments, and they'll take people with perfect digits, quarter them and subject them to feeding taps, and that's 2020 eugenics debauchery level disgust. So there's no excuse. There's no ways of getting out of it. There's no other here. It's about stopping this disgusting crime in the legislature. And if medicos didn't get any funding to do it, there would still be some medicos wanting to enslave and torture people, because medicos like to violate people in horrifically cruel ways, some of them to investigate their theories. Horrible, isn't it? But it's true. And there's nothing sensible in what medicos do when they do that. Most clearly, it's just to threaten big companies and gain military secrets. It's about power, and more power, a crime, and more grotesque crime, and potential growth than the potential gross. And it doesn't matter what kind of disability a medico wants to say a person has, even if the disability is caused by the forced drugging or other forced or coerced procedures. All that matters to government and the medico mafia is the gross and using the gross to get more gross, and that's medico mafia, and they need to be arrested and have their assets frozen and made to pay reparations. It's obvious, and it's got to happen sooner than later. What Australian government officials think is necessary and as a last resort and subject to safeguards in the prosecuting of psychiatrists for slavery and torture should be about disabling psychiatrists rather than victims of psychiatrists, as government officials have been legislating for since Federation. We need a turnaround here. It's likely that the psychiatrists won't be arrested easily, though. And I might have to bring the military in to take physical action and against any sort of terrorist activity from the psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and the mental health coterie. And the violence that they've been inflicting on the population for some time, if that were to increase. Anyway, that disabling of psychiatrists and their coterie, that would need to have to be subject to safeguards and it as a last resort. I think you understand now the situation that we're in. Abolishing psychiatry, repealing the Victorian Mental Health Act, and looking at government and thinking, okay, which officials are not going to go with the corruption? And there's some officials, government officials there, that are going to do the right thing by the people and remove that vile, cruel, disgusting acts of slavery and acts of torture that is the Mental Health Act of Victoria.